never imagined that a dripping radiator valve could turn into the most unexpected moment of recognition in my quiet life. The afternoon light had already gone soft around the edges of my living room, the kind of amber that makes dust motes look like they're dancing with purpose. My chamomile tea had gone cold on the side table, and the steady plink-plink-plink of water hitting the towel I'd placed on the hardwood floor had become a rhythm I'd almost stopped hearing. What happened next would change the way I understood the word companionship. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived alone in this house for 9 years since Michael passed. The silence here has weight now, a presence I've grown accustomed to, like a second skin. My days follow a pattern so familiar I could navigate them with my eyes closed. The creak of the 7th stair on my way down for breakfast, the particular way the morning sun pools on the kitchen linoleum, the 3 o'clock shadow that moves across the parlor wall. When the valve started leaking that Tuesday morning, I stared at it for a full hour before admitting I couldn't fix it myself. I hadn't called anyone for help in months. The phone felt foreign in my hand as I dialed the number for a heating repair service I'd found in the yellowed pages of an old directory. The woman who answered scheduled someone for that afternoon, and I spent the intervening hours tidying things I hadn't touched in weeks, suddenly aware of how a stranger might see my space. He arrived at 4:30, just as the light was beginning its slow turn toward evening. Thomas, he said his name was, and he was somewhere in his late 50s, though he moved like someone who had decided not to be in a hurry anymore. He carried his toolbox with a kind of reverence, holding it close to his body rather than letting it swing. His hands were steady when he shook mine, and his eyes held that particular warmth that comes from having seen difficulty and chosen gentleness anyway. He wore a canvas jacket that smelled faintly of metal and last winter's wood smoke. When he stepped into the hallway, he paused for a moment, looking at the photographs on my wall with a quiet attention that most people don't give to the lives of strangers. I noticed then that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow, and I found myself wondering about its story in a way I hadn't wondered about anything in a long time. He knelt before the radiator with the ease of someone who knows how to occupy space without demanding anything of it. The room seemed to shrink around us, or perhaps it was simply that his presence filled the corners that had been empty for so long. I could hear his breathing, slow and measured, between the metallic clicks of his tools. The smell of old pipes and fresh oil filled the narrow space. I found myself standing closer than I'd intended, leaning against the doorframe with my arms crossed, watching the way his fingers moved with such certainty over the parts that baffled me. Without thinking, I drifted into the kitchen and put the kettle on again, a ritual of offering that felt clumsy after years of only brewing for one. I washed a teacup that was already clean, just to have something to do with my hands while the warmth of another person being near me worked its way through layers of practiced solitude. The task paused when he needed a part from his truck, and we stood in the hallway together, the silence between us different from the kind I'd grown used to. He asked about the house, how long I'd lived here, and I heard myself telling him things I hadn't said aloud in years. He asked what my husband had done for work, and the question landed so softly I didn't realize it had opened something until I was already speaking. Michael had been an engineer, I told him, always fixing things, always building solutions. Thomas nodded slowly, and then he shared that his wife had passed 3 years ago, that he'd moved back to this neighborhood after decades away, that his daughter called on Sundays but the space between those calls had grown wider than he'd expected. When he said, "Some leaks you can't see until they've already done their damage," he was looking at the radiator, but his voice carried a weight that told me we weren't talking about plumbing anymore. I paused, holding my breath, afraid the moment might break if I moved. The sky outside had darkened while we talked, and rain began to tap against the windows with gentle persistence. Thomas mentioned that the valve would need a second adjustment after the pressure test, that he should stay until the system cycled through completely. I heard myself asking if he'd like some soup, and the word surprised me as much as the ease with which he accepted. We sat at my kitchen table, the same oak Michael and I had found at an estate sale 40 years ago, our hands wrapped around warm mugs. The tomato soup was from a can, but I heated it slowly, stirring in a splash of cream I found in the back of the refrigerator. We looked out at the same wet garden, the same drooping roses, and time did something strange then. It both stretched out like taffy and compressed into something precious and small. He didn't rush through his bowl. I didn't clear the dishes. We simply remained, two people who had forgotten what it felt like to have company that didn't need to be entertained. The conversation deepened as the rain continued. I told him about the silence that had become my companion, how I'd learned to tell myself that being alone was a choice, even when it felt like a sentence. I described the way I missed not the grand gestures of marriage, but the small, ordinary presence. Michael's reading glasses left on the counter, the sound of his key in the door, the warmth of another body making the bed feel inhabited. Thomas listened without the pity that makes loneliness feel like failure. He told me about the house he'd bought after his wife died, how he'd stripped it down to essentials, thinking that simplicity would heal the emptiness. He spoke of his sons, grown and busy with their own families, how he understood their distance but couldn't help feeling like a chapter they'd already finished reading. The recognition of loneliness meeting loneliness happened without either of us naming it directly. It was simply there in the space between our words, acknowledged and allowed. We fell quiet after a while, the only sound the rain and our breathing, and that silence felt like the truest thing I'd shared with anyone in years. When he stood to leave, the rain had softened to a mist. He reached for my hand in the hallway, his fingers warm and calloused, and held it for a moment that wasn't quite a handshake and wasn't quite anything else. His thumb brushed across my knuckles with such gentle certainty that I felt something inside me shift, a door opening that I believed was welded shut. The gesture wasn't passion, it was acknowledgement, a quiet confirmation that we had seen each other fully, perhaps for the first time in either of our lives. I didn't pull away. I didn't analyze what it meant or what anyone might think. I simply stood there and allowed myself to be touched, to be seen, to be recognized as someone still capable of connection. The feeling of his hand in mine was warmer than any blanket I'd pulled around myself in those long nights of aloneness. He said he'd return in a week to check the pressure, that we might take a drive to the nursery if I wanted help choosing tomato plants for spring. I watched him walk down my front steps, his canvas jacket disappearing into the gray evening, and I stood at the door long after his truck had pulled away. The house settled back into its familiar creaks and shadows, but something fundamental had changed. I walked to the radiator and placed my hand on its now warm surface, understanding that while Thomas had fixed the leak, he had also repaired something far more essential in me. Some repairs go deeper than the wall they fix. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. It means a great deal to us. You can spend years believing that your story has reached its final chapter, and then life sends someone to remind you that every ending is just a pause, waiting for the courage to begin again.